The letters revealed that the spice wasn't just a memory, it was a catalyst. When used by someone with a pure heart, it could heal the spirit of a community. But in the hands of the selfish, it was just salt. The Order of the Silver Spatula wants it because they think it's a spice for kings, Janet realized. But it only works for roommates. This was the final piece of the architecture. The building stood not because of the arch or the hinges, but because the spirit of the people was literally seasoned by the truth. Chapter 49. The Italian Departure 2. To get the vial back, Sophie and Victor realized they couldn't just use force. They had to go back to the source Calabria to find the counter spice. They returned to Santo Nicola di Trippa, but this time they were pursued by the Order's drones. Nonna Rosa met them again, her eyes knowing. "You seek the bitter root," she said through the translator. "The salt brings the balance, but the root brings the clarity. One cannot exist without the other." She led them deeper into the cave, to a spot where the salt-heavy air met an underground spring. There, growing in the dark, were translucent, pale roots that smelled of ozone and earth. "Take the root, Sophie," Nonna Rosa commanded. "When the Count uses the salt to feed his ego, the root will show him the architecture of his own lies." The journey back was a race against time. The Order was planning a feast of the century in Paris, where they would use the salt of the earth to manipulate the world's most powerful leaders into signing a treaty that would give the Order control over the world's food supply. Chapter 50. The final revelation. The Paris Opera House was filled with the elite. Sophie and Victor, disguised as catering staff, watched as Count Valerius prepared the main course. He held the vial over a massive silver tureen, his face glowing with a dark triumph. As he sprinkled the dark crimson grains into the soup, Sophie stepped forward. "Wait!" she shouted. The Count laughed. "Too late, Sophie. The world is about to taste the truth of kings." "No," Sophie said, pulling the bitter root from her pocket and dropping it into the tureen. "They're about to taste the truth of the people." The reaction was instantaneous. The soup didn't turn into a magical elixir. Every person who took a sip didn't feel like a king. They felt the weight of their own deceptions. The room was filled not with power, but with a profound, collective shame. Count Valerius, who had tasted the soup first, collapsed. He saw the glass horizon of his ego crumbling into the sea. "The architecture," he gasped. "It's not glass. It's wood." Sophie and Victor walked out of the opera house, the vial back in their hands. They didn't return it to the display case. They took it back to apartment 201, where Jack, Janet, and Cindy were waiting with a simple dinner of grilled cheese and tomato soup. Sophie opened the vial and sprinkled a single grain into each of their bowls. "What is it, Sophie?" Jack asked. "It's just salt, Dad," she said, smiling. "But it's our salt." As they sat together, the five of them, the boardwalk outside was quiet, the waves a gentle pulse against the sand. The architecture of a lie was a ghost of the past. The architecture of truth was a monument for the future. But the architecture of home, that was just a table, some soup, and the people who would always be there when you knocked on the door. Chapter 51. Dissonance in the Hall of Mirrors. The morning after the Paris revelation, the world was a different place. The mirror soup had not only exposed the elites, but had also created a massive, global thirst for authenticity. Sophie Tripper, the woman who had dropped the bitter root, was no longer just a chef. She was a symbol. Back in Santa Monica, a sea of cameras and reporters had anchored themselves in front of Tripper's table. They weren't looking for a recipe. They were looking for a confession. "Everyone wants to be a roommate now," Jack sighed, watching the crowds from the balcony of apartment 201. "They think if they eat our food, their lies will disappear." Sophie sat at the table, her head in her hands. The weight of being the world's truth-teller was exhausting. Victor was constantly busy, not with photography, but with managing legal threats from the remaining members of the Order of the Silver Spatula, who were rebranding themselves as a philosophical institute to avoid prosecution. "We need to go back to the blueprint, Sophie," Victor said, placing a hand on her shoulder. "The architecture isn't about the world, It's about this building. Chapter 52. The Foundation of Sophie and Victor. In the midst of the global chaos, Sophie and Victor decided it was time to build their own foundation. They announced their engagement, but not with a celebrity gala. They chose to have the ceremony in the basement of the Regal Beagle, among the thousands of photographs Larry Dallas had taken. The preparation for the wedding became a neighborhood project. Janet designed the Lilies of Clarity, while Cindy organized a truth dance class at her gyms to raise money for the Boardwalk's new youth program. But as the date approached, a mysterious letter arrived at apartment 201. It wasn't signed by a count or a corporate lawyer. It was written in a familiar, shaky hand on a piece of stationery from a long-defunct hotel in La Jolla. The turtle is still hungry, Jack, and the light is still on. Meet me where the building first sank. Jack's face went pale. It can't be. Chapter 53. The Return to the Sinking Floor. The letter led Jack, Janet, and Cindy down to the storage rooms beneath the apartment complex. There, in the dim light, sat a figure in an impeccably preserved, albeit dusty, tangerine leisure suit. "Mr. Furley?" Janet whispered. The figure turned. It wasn't Ralph Furley, but his younger brother, Bart Furley, whom they had briefly met decades ago. He was holding a small, silver key, the twin to the one Jack had used to secure the Beaumont bequest. "Ralph always told me this building had a secret floor," Bart said, his voice rasping. "He said the architecture of a lie was only half the story. There's a basement beneath the basement. A place where the original architect, Arthur Prynne's father, kept the real records of the land." They followed Bart to a hidden elevator behind a stack of old mattresses. As they descended, the air grew cool and smelled of ancient cedar. The elevator opened into a room filled with blueprints that weren't for Santa Monica, but for a city that never was. A city built entirely on the principles of the salt of the earth, where every home was connected by shared kitchens and no one lived alone. Chapter 54. The Architect's Dream. Sophie and Victor joined them in the hidden city. They realized that the architecture of a lie isn't just a clever name for their history. It was a defensive maneuver. Arthur Prynne had hidden the plans for this honest city because the world wasn't ready for it. He wasn't protecting a spice, Sophie realized, tracing the lines of a communal garden. He was protecting a way of life. The lies, Jack told Furley. They were the only way to keep this place from being turned into a factory or a mall a century ago. The revelation shifted everything. Sophie didn't want to just be a chef anymore. She wanted to be the architect of this new world. She and Victor decided to turn the Tripper's Table Culinary School into a global network. They would teach not just cooking, but the architecture of connection. They would show people how to build apartment 201S in their own cities, places where the door is always open, even if the rent is a little high and the roommates are a little crazy. Chapter 55. The Eternal Knock. Reprise. The wedding of Sophie Tripper and Victor Dallas was a symphony of history and future. Sophie wore a dress woven with silk from Calabria, and Victor carried his father's first camera. The ceremony ended not with a kiss, but with a knock. The entire neighborhood stood outside the Regal Beagle and knocked on the door in unison, a rhythmic, thunderous sound that echoed across the Pacific. It was the sound of a community claiming its truth. Jack and Janet sat on the balcony of 201 later that night. Sophie and Victor had already departed for their honeymoon, a trek through the hills of Calabria to find more bitter root for the world. "Do you think it will last, Jack?" Janet asked, leaning her head on his shoulder. Jack looked at the apartment behind them. The furniture was a mix of 70s wicker and modern oak. The kitchen was clean. The light in the bathroom was miraculously off. "The building might sink one day, Janet," Jack said softly. "The ocean might come for the boardwalk. But as long as someone is waiting for that knock, the architecture is solid." A soft sound came from the hallway. A new tenant, a young man who looked as confused and earnest as Jack had been in 1977. "Excuse me," the young man said. "I'm looking for apartment 201. I heard this was a place where you never have to be alone." Jack smiled, the same mischievous twinkle as bright as ever. He stood up and walked to the door. "Come on in," Jack said, stepping back and holding the door wide. "We've been waiting for you." As the Santa Monica moon rose, The golden facade of the building glowed with a light that didn't come from the sun. It was the light of the truth. Finally, perfectly, at home. Chapter 56. The Italian Echo. The dust of Calabria was a different kind of earth. For Sophie and Victor, their trek through the rugged hills of Nonna Rosa's village was less of a vacation and more of a pilgrimage. They spent their days digging for the bitter root and their nights translating the journals they had found in the hidden honest city beneath apartment 201. Victor, look at this entry, from 1922, Sophie said, pointing to a faded ink sketch in Arthur Prynne's father's hand. He mentions the silent oven of Calabria. He says the architecture of the building was literally modeled after the way the heat flows in those ancient stone caves. The discovery was interrupted by the appearance of a local carabiniere, a young officer named Marco, who had been watching them from a distance. He didn't approach them with a ticket, but with a question. "You are the ones from the news?" Marco asked in broken English. Sophie nodded tentatively. Marco sighed and pulled a small, silver locket from his pocket. "In this village, we have many secrets, but since your soup, the people, they talk. My grandfather, he says, the salt of the earth was never meant to be a spice. It was a catalyst for a type of clay. A clay that can never be broken." Sophie and Victor realized that the Order of the Silver Spatula had been looking for a flavor, but the real power was structural. The architecture of Ali was a physical reality. Chapter 57. The Apprentice of Apartment 201.